Hi, everyone, and welcome to the third of the 2025 Eleanor Williams Hooker Tea Talk series. Today's panel is titled The Great Migration, Military Service and the Shaping of a Diversified New Hampshire. We will hear from a group of experts who will discuss the integration of military bases in New Hampshire and how military service became a tool for asserting rights and claiming full citizenship. On the screen, you will see a question and a link. Please use that link to answer the question, and your answers will be populated into this word cloud that you see here. The larger the words is, the larger words are the most popular amongst you all. And later, during the Q&A portion, you will have the opportunity to raise your virtual hand, turn off your mic when you're called on, and ask your question to the panel. You are also able to ask your questions in the chat if you prefer not to speak, and we will be monitoring that as we move along today. Our annual Tea Talk series would not be possible without the New Hampshire Humanities Grant and other generous sponsors. And our moderator today is Sharon Tarleton, the program manager at the University of New Hampshire's Office of Community, Equity, and Diversity. So please welcome Sharon.
Thanks, Daria, and shout out to another person who is a UNH alum. Thank you for having me to the Black Heritage Trail. My great appreciation in just having this partnership. We had a lovely webinar that Jerry Ann was on for the University of New Hampshire as well in honoring Black History Month. And I would like to say again, happy Black History Month, because I know that there are spaces and places where this month is kind of called into question in this moment in history. And so I would love to thank you all for being here on this snowy day in celebration of what we know is a time-honored legacy of coming together and celebrating Black history. So I would like to first introduce my panelists who are here, and I know that Gina will be helping us out to put a link in the chat for everyone to be able to read the full bios on the Black Heritage Trail website if you would prefer. But I will be introducing them in the order that they will present to us today. So we have Leah Dearborn here with us, who is the Associate Director of the Aviation Museum in Manchester, New Hampshire. Leah is going to be sharing with us some great information about specifically the New Hampshire history around war and military service, particularly the Grenier Air Force Base. I would also like to introduce, we have with us Andrea Williamson, who is a financial advisor for Edward Jones, who also has been a part of the military for many different years and in many different ways, working and also with family members who have served as well. Andrea is going to be speaking to us about some of her personal narrative and history. And then we also have Timothy August with us today, who is the 2013 student body president at the Military Academy. So sorry, I just lost track of where I was. Who is the class president of 2013 at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And Timothy is going to be speaking to us today about some of the intersectional work that he has done related to Black patriotism and also thinking about personhood in relation to our larger systems of military service. So I'd like to thank all of my panelists who are joining us today. And just in a note of unity and also community, if there's anyone in the audience today who is military adjacent, who's served, or who has had family that served, if you would like to put that in the chat, it would be interesting, at least for me, to see how many folks out here are connected to the military in some way. And I would like to just state, in our preparatory call, I was speaking a little bit about my own background, and I said, I'm just moderating this panel, but Jerry Ann very kindly reminded me that I'm also a part of it as well. So just in taking a moment to set the stage a little bit for our conversation, I would also like to call upon myself for some of the history that I have related to military service. So I have many family members who have been part of different branches of the military. And in being asked to do this talk, this is not actually something that the Black Heritage Trail knew about me. But as a person who identifies as multiracial, I actually have family members who are of varying different racial identities who've served in the military. And just to be able to go back and look at the history and some of the disparities that have occurred based off of those racial identities has been very interesting. My mother's very interested in genealogy, so there's a lot there to unpack. And particularly looking at some of the systemic ways that military service has been a vehicle for upward mobility, and also in some of the systemic ways that our socio-political culture has created layers and levels. I specifically think a lot about the GI Bill and redlining and different sociological concepts that have been related to military service and benefits. And I know that in this present day and age, we have a lot of those same similar topics and coming up. And so I would love to just pass it over to Leah without further ado to give us a little bit of historical context around New Hampshire specifically, and also some national trends within the military history. So thank you, Leah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. I'm very honored to be here today. And a little bit about my background. So I'm the Associate Director of the Aviation Museum of New Hampshire. So a lot of my focus is on very local history, specifically related to military and aviation. And I'm here in part because I recently wrote a book about Grenier Air Force Base, which was located on what is now the site of the Manchester-Boston Regional Airport. And I have a couple of slides, but I want to say first on the historical element that Black troops have a history of service from the state of New Hampshire going back to the Revolution, and it's not a new phenomenon. It's Many have served very gallantly for many centuries, but my focus, because I've done so much research specifically around the World War II era, I have a couple of slides specifically about Grenier to share with you all. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Okay, and hopefully you can all see this okay. Um, I do a more in-depth presentation about Grenier Air Force Base and generally sort of the project and the research that we've done as an organization on the site. But for this, I'm just going to kind of hone in on a couple key topics. So during World War II, the armed forces were still segregated. In June of 1941, Executive Order 8802 was passed by FDR. However, that applied mainly to defense workers who were engaged in war-related work. So segregation in the armed forces for the duration of the war was still present until 1948, World War II having ended in 1945. And during World War II, 2.5 million African American men registered for the armed forces. And in addition, thousands of Black women served in all theaters of operations. And they could have been doing any number of roles. There was an interesting group called the 366, the 3666s that actually delivered mail that I've been studying a little bit more on. And there was a number from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, who I won't get to too much on her, but very interesting and a pretty wide variety of roles that people were doing. So you heard me talk about Grenier, a little bit about that. This building that you see in this photo is actually where I work today. It was built in 1937, and it was an officer's headquarters during the war. So if you come and visit us in Londonderry, New Hampshire, this is actually the building that you will walk through today. But Grenier Air Base had over 6,000 servicemen at any given time during World War II. So it was a pretty major operation, and it's where thousands of men flew over to the overseas theater of combat because it was a convenient jumping off point from the North Atlantic up through Greenland, Newfoundland, then Scotland, and down into England, where soldiers would then move on to Germany or North Africa in some cases. And it was a pretty quick expansion. It was only 72 days apart from where you see these farm fields to when it was a major base of operations. So we're talking just massive development in a really, really short period of time. And it threw together people from all walks of life, from all across the country, who probably never would have interacted before. And this is a photo of the aviation squadron. Many of the Black soldiers who were stationed at Grenier Air Base were in the aviation squadron. And so here you can see a photo of them. They were doing a bond drive here. But part of the reason why, when I was doing the research for this book, I was able to find out a little bit about their lives from at least just a snippet from their own perspectives, was because they were actually writing the base newspaper. And that's kind of where I got a lot of the information for them on this, because they were literally doing all the communications on the base. And because the armed forces were still segregated at the time, in their newspaper reports of their day-to-day life, they talked about living in this area called the Village, which, if you're in Londonderry today, near our museum, to my best ability, where I can find where this was located was up kind of near Akira Way. And you can kind of see where it is on an old base map here. And if you were to go into the woods where that is now, this is what you'll find there. You can find an old foundation. And the way that I kind of double check this, I can't be 100% sure that this is where the Village barracks was located, but I've talked to a few other people who have done research on Grenier Air Base, and they all kind of concluded the same site based on in-person interviews with surviving veterans conducted in the 90s and early 2000s. So this is a little bit about the newspaper that they were writing. It was called The Beacon. And by September 1942, there were 800 Black soldiers stationed at Grenier. And they were publishing this paper with a masthead that read, "To keep your spirit up and keep down the Axis." This is one of the individuals who was in charge of writing it. He was known as Hutch, and he was a very qualified newspaper writer and editor. He came from the Afro-American in Baltimore, Maryland, which did employ Links and Hughes for one period of time. Just a couple of photos of what people did around the base in their spare time. Boxing was very, very popular, as was basketball. And you might be wondering sort of what people would do on the base. The aviation squadron was in charge of guarding the base. So they were essentially military police of the day. And they did communications as well. But separately of the aviation squadron, another role that Black soldiers played was, here we have the 366. They were one of only 4 U.S. regiments at the time with all Black officers. You can see in this photo, they're stepping off at Grenier. They're getting off the train. And they were active in both World War I and World War II. They guarded bridges, railroad trestles, Air Force bases from Cape Cod to Canada. And in the process of writing this book, I was up at the Tilton Veterans Home, speaking to quite a few men over the age of 100 who were their only remaining World War II veterans. And one of them actually did recall seeing these individuals during the war, guarding different communities around the state. And they were unique in that they were actually sent on to combat. They went to Italy in 1944, and they were assigned to guard duties there, but they weren't given a lot of additional training, which was common for units of Black troops at the time. They weren't often sent into combat, and so tragically, as a result, they weren't as prepared. And this was something that was intentional on the part of a number of US commanders. And this was something that happened in the 366. Their group in particular, I like to bring up because they had a truly lasting impact following the war. One of their members, at the urging of friends from that specific unit, went on to run for Congress, Edward Brooke. And when he entered the Senate in 1966, he became the first popularly elected Black senator. And it was these experiences that he had, which started at Fort Devens and around Grenier, that motivated him to do this. A little bit on what else was happening here at home during this period of time. There was a clear contradiction between fighting to sustain democracy abroad and then feeling discrimination back here at home. This was something that was felt by African American defense workers as well as soldiers. And on January 31st of, I believe it was 1944, the Pittsburgh Courier published a letter by 26-year-old James Thompson, who was a defense worker who he was confined to working in a cafeteria of an aircraft manufacturing company, but couldn't work with everybody else, which made absolutely no sense from a logistical standpoint. And he was motivated to write this letter called "Should I Sacrifice to Live Half American?", which started something called the Double V campaign, which was V for victory. So the sign being used to signify triumph over the aggression against the Axis, but also racism at home. And I'm just going to kind of end what I have to say by speaking a bit about after World War II. Of course, in 1948, the armed forces were desegregated by that order. Things obviously didn't change overnight, but I think if you go back and you look at some of these yearbooks that were published year after year at Grenier Air Force Base, which operated until the 1960s, slowly you start to see things change. People's roles diversified as well. People on the base of every background were doing broader tasks. And here you can see several Black soldiers who were involved with fighting forest fires up in the White Mountains. And how am I doing for time? But that's just kind of a small snippet of what the research we've done on Grenier Air Force Base. Of course, that's only one base out of New Hampshire, but being an aviation museum, we sort of specialize on the aviation component of this particular point in heritage. So just trying to figure out where my sharing component is.
Thank you, Leah, so much for sharing all of that with us. I particularly was struck by the fact that you utilized a lot of primary source data, particularly yearbooks, and also doing interviews with folks, like learning from the oral history and tradition of people who were there. And I think that it's so important to catalog those narratives and to also utilize those historical artifacts, because I think a lot of the things that folks talk about when we're thinking about racial dynamics and in history, it's about the narrative, and it's about really being able to archive and save those types of materials to be able to use them as signposts back into history. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and really appreciate that. So thank you for sharing all of that with us. And I would love to bring Andrea into the conversation, especially because in that theme of looking at personal histories, personal stories, narratives, and having that be an archival tool, I know that Andrea has a lot of personal historical information to share with us as well. So Andrea, if you are available, please share with us your wisdom.
Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Jerry Ann and the Black Heritage Trail, for giving me an opportunity to share my story. And I was hoping that to recognize if there are military, any affiliation to the military, I just want to thank you for your service. I understand the sacrifice that's required for not only the serving members, but the family. So thank you. And if my story is reflecting on any part of your story, give me a thumbs up and let me know. Encouragement is a good thing. So my name is Andrea Williamson. I am the daughter of military veterans, Thomas and Jarvis Williamson, and this is my military story. So my father's decision to join the military, and this is a 70s, 80s story, was to better his life and the life of his potential family. He grew up in a small town, and like other teenagers, he wanted to make his way. And so he enlisted in the United States Air Force along with his 5 brothers. It was not, and I repeat, not a patriotic decision. It was an economic decision, like so many other decisions. Biweekly paycheck, career building skill training, free healthcare, pension for life, free education, home buying assistance, 3 meals a day, free housing, life insurance, and a chance to see the world. What he probably didn't realize as a young teenager was the impact of that economic decision and what it would set in motion as a part of his legacy. So as a child, I grew up in a military family. I moved everywhere. We moved from place to place, in and out of different schools, meeting people from all over the world, different cultures, different environments, different things to think about. We learned not to attach to anything. We learned to go forward and not look back. We learned never to get stuck. Change, change, change. That was our family. This was, I believe, and I'm owning it, the start of my love for travel and why I have visited over 50 countries to date, and I plan to visit another 50 in the next 5 years. Thank goodness for the international airport that's only an hour away from New Hampshire, and the C&J bus line that takes me literally door to door. So I want to say thanks, Mom and Dad. My father's last assignment was Pease Air Force Base, and that's when Pease was really booming. Military was coming and going. This was not a choice. It was an assignment. We were assigned here. We have a saying in the military that says, you go where your paycheck goes. And the paycheck was coming to New Hampshire, and so was our family. As you already know, and as has already been mentioned, the military is a diverse organization. And at that time, the Air Force Base here in New Hampshire was bringing in military left and right. And Portsmouth grew from these military personnel moving here. They supported local businesses, they voted, we paid taxes, we were a part of this larger community. We also, within the military family, because the military is a big community that takes care of itself, we built smaller communities. And so my folks actually created their own communities within the military community. My mother was a part of the founding group of the first Black church in New Hampshire. That was New Hope Baptist Church, for those that you remember, on Pearl Street. And she worked as a social worker for New Hampshire Health and Human Services for over 30 years here in New Hampshire before she retired. She also led as president the New Hampshire chapter of Altrusa, which is a national nonprofit organization of businesses and professional women. And my father, while in the military here, he repaired fighter jets. He was a hydraulic mechanic. He founded a scratch golfers league called the Straight Eights, where they played competitively all over the New Hampshire and many other places outside this state. And when he retired after 25 years, he started a small golf club repair shop, his own business. And he managed the maintenance crew at the Pease golf course. That was his second career. My father loved golf. It was his passion. It's what he loved to do. And he built community here in New Hampshire around what he liked to do. My parents used their VA home loan military benefit and secured a home for us to live in. And in that time, most of the military folks that decided to stay here in New Hampshire, they all owned homes. We lived in a community, Maple Haven, that at one point seemed like it was just all military people. The difference is what we found was that stayed with us as children. So my siblings and I, who are also military, we used our VA benefits to acquire our first home. And this was the beginning of our wealth building discipline. My parents sent all 3 of us to college. They didn't go to college, but all of us did. My brother and my sister, they attended the University of New Hampshire, and I attended the University of Maryland. My siblings and I used our military GI Bill education benefits to get advanced degrees. My parents raised us to respect the military and many of its opportunities, and to serve with dignity, and to use our benefits, and to be proud to be part of the military. We enjoy being in the military here in New Hampshire. We are a military family. My brother and I both served, although he didn't join the Air Force, he went Army. We still love him. And my sister married an Air Force officer. And so overall, we are an Air Force family through and through. Our stay in New Hampshire was good to my family. Upon my father's retirement after 25 years, they had a choice to move away, to go home, to go back home, or to go anywhere they wanted to go. And I remember them having conversations, although brief, because what they decided to do was they chose to stay in New Hampshire for reasons such as the deep, long-term friendships in the community that they helped to build. They stayed because in the community where we lived, all of the military people that we knew owned their own homes. And when I say owned, they paid their mortgages off. So they were true homeowners. There were business and economic opportunities. Most of them started second careers. A lot of the small businesses that are up on Lafayette Road, well, used to at that time, remember now they're all in their 90s and beyond, but a lot of those businesses were owned by a lot of these military folks who had come here through Pease Air Force Base. And then, of course, the lifestyle in New Hampshire, which includes the beautiful White Mountains for hiking and fishing. A lot of them had boats. And the ocean for sunrise, which I still take advantage of every day to this day. I personally served in the United States Air Force in a joint command. I was stationed in Stuttgart, Germany, and in the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. But funny thing, my decision to move back to New Hampshire was also economic. And my decision to stay mirrors my family. I am the proud mom of 3 amazing daughters. 2 of them went to college on lacrosse scholarships in the Midwest, and my youngest daughter attended the University of New Hampshire and graduated summa cum laude. My family's homeowner legacy continues, with my youngest daughter purchasing her first home last month. And my middle daughter is living in London, where I grew up. My oldest daughter moved here for a promotion, again, an economic decision, and to be closer to the family. And all 3 of them travel the world. So our legacy here in New Hampshire and in the military continues. And that's my story.
Thanks, Andrea, so much for sharing your story with us. You're so animated. I love it. And I also want to call attention to this idea of kingdom, which I saw in the word cloud when we first started. Folks were talking about kingdom, and to me, a lot of what you just talked about, it's about becoming kin, right? It's being a part of those neighborhoods, a part of those shared histories and shared experiences as a military family, and just being able to in the words of Sun Tzu, right, who we're highlighting for this talk, using the terrain to one's advantage. So it sounded like a lot of the things that you learned and understood about being a part of the military and having that kingdom connection, you then use that to your advantage and pass that along to your family as well. So thank you so much for sharing your story with us. And so I would love to turn next to Timothy to speak to us a little bit about this duality between perhaps being, within the military and then also being, of yourself an individual and a person. Just reading your bio, Timothy, I was very intrigued. I would love to go and read some more of your work and just understanding how, again, when we're thinking about this terrain and understanding that being a part of the military, we are potentially a part of something bigger and greater, but not losing track of the fact that we are ourselves an individual as well.
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Timothy. It's a pleasure to meet with you all. I think for me, when we talk about military service or just anything that involves like how we're going to spend our time on the earth, it's usually just helpful to have a story, since that's, we're all humans. Stories seem to resonate. So here's the start of mine. On November 4th, 2008, around 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I found myself in the day room, a gathering place for cadets to seek community and occasionally a place to receive punishment when a rule was broken. Around me sat a diverse set of classmates, Black men from Atlanta, evangelical children from Montana, Iraq War veterans who had recently returned home from fighting. The fluorescent lights carved deeper shadows under our eyes as we watched CNN's holograms pop up featuring will.i.am offering commentary along Anderson Cooper. In the corner, a fellow Carolinian sat on a stained blue couch, a spit bottle in hand, a pitch of dip tucked into his lower lip. His presence, a young white man from the eastern part of the state, reflected the complex demographics of military service. The atmosphere was initially light, but we all knew that the speculation about who was leading in the polls was about to end. The country stood on the precipice of electing either a Black liberal man from Illinois or a white conservative war hero from Arizona. At 9:07 p.m., the call for Pennsylvania went to President Obama. A Black classmate of mine from Columbus, Georgia, the son of an Army family with a brother in his third year at West Point, turned to me with a nervous laughter and said, "Yo, Obama might do this, man." His smile, a mixture of disbelief and excitement, mirrored the faces on the television screen as the camera panned from the Ebenezer Church in Atlanta to the sea of faces in Chicago. I glanced at my classmate from North Carolina and noticed his breath quickening, his spit bottle full of his mouth cleared of tobacco. A quiet rage was growing in our day room, in stark contrast to the joy building up on our television screens. By 10:41 p.m., Ohio was called for Obama. The dam had broke. It was a well-known fact that no Republican had ever won the White House without Ohio. What happened next revealed the fault lines that had always existed beneath the surface of our supposed unity. At West Point's main campus, a white rage had erupted. Over the central guard room loudspeaker, a speaker that can be heard all throughout the campus, was the sound that had been reverberating that turned out to be actually monkey sounds directed at the Black cadets in the hallway, along with the Communist National Anthem being played. Unable to directly target our newly elected President Obama, some of the white cadets turned their rage toward the Black faces they saw, blaming them for his victory. The night became a touchstone moment for me, a crystallization of the complex relationship between Black service members and the nation we chose to serve. My own family's military connection began with my uncle, who served in the Army during the first Gulf War. His service took him far from his North Carolina roots, eventually leading him to a life in Florida. Like so many Black service members, he found that the military offered pathways to places and possibilities that civilian life had often denied him because of the color of his skin. During my own service years later, I met countless Black veterans whose stories echo similar themes. Their military service had taken them far from their own roots to bases across America and overseas. Many chose to build lives in these communities, creating fresh new branches of the Great Migration story through their service. The military offers something unique during the Great Migration, a structured pathway to skills, education, and social mobility, as mentioned before. But it also provides something less tangible, the authority of the uniform, a shield, however imperfect, against some forms of discrimination, and an institutional backing that made it slightly easier to navigate hostile spaces, something that I was very conscious of when I chose to serve. I think about my own experience at West Point, even in 2008, despite the ugly response to Obama's election, we, the Black cadets, had something our civilian counterparts often didn't: an institutional framework, a strong sense of community that we allowed ourselves to ingratiate in through clubs, activities. Many of the clubs and activities that President Trump has decided to disband over the past few weeks. Today, as I visit military installations across the country, including visit back to West Point, I see how Black service members continue to transform spaces through their presence and persistence. On bases large and small, in communities urban and rural, they're writing new chapters of the Great Migration story, one duty station at a time, one retirement at a time, one family at a time, one business at a time. When I think back to the election night in 2008, I'm struck by how it parallels the quiet revolutions that Black service members have been leading for generations. Each time we put on the uniform, each time we make a home in unexpected places, we're declaring that our service isn't just to the nation as it is, but to the nation as it could be. The story of Black military service reminds us that transformation happens not just in dramatic moments, but in the daily decisions to stay, to serve, to build community in places where our presence itself becomes an act of revolution. It's a story that will continue for many generations, expanding the boundaries of belonging, one nation at a time. The Great Migration isn't just a story, it's an ongoing journey of claiming space and transforming communities through service and presence. And across America, it's a story written in part through the courage and commitment of Black Americans in uniform who understood that serving their country meant not just defending it, but helping it become what it always should be. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Timothy. I really appreciated you putting that together and walking us through that personal narrative. I think there are a lot of parallels and a lot of saliency to the time that we have going on today in history, particularly when you were talking about just a level of resilience and also just being able to show up and be present and how that speaks volumes as well. I'm thinking about the recent um, restoration of the Tuskegee Airmen story that's happened basically through folks standing up and saying, you know, we need to have this history told, that we want to have this representation. I think that combating the mythology around spaces like New Hampshire, that, you know, it's somebody wrote, you know, a couple folks actually, I think, because it was a larger word in the cloud, overdue, when they were talking about that first question. And, you know, I would just respectfully say, I think that folks have always been, you know, here. There's this mythology around New Hampshire being a predominantly white space, which of course it is. But that being said, there have always been, you know, folks like Andrea's family out here. There have always been, you know, folks like you, Timothy, at, you know, spaces like West Point, and being there. And I think that that level of community, that's what helps to shift that narrative. And then being able to bring in some of the archival pieces like Leah has brought in, that just shows us how far back that presence goes, even to folks who are, you know, 100 years old, talking about remembering those from the 366 standing out there. So I really appreciated this conversation, and just being able to be here as a part of it. And I would love to just have a little bit of conversation amongst our panel around just some of the themes that were brought up. So during our preparatory call, before this engagement, we talked about this idea of being brothers in arms, and unification really within the military, having it be a unifying force, and expanding some of this idea from the unity within the military space to the external community. Do you see, any of my panelists, a burgeoning opportunity for similar unification around today's societal issues, even during peacetime?
Can you ask the question again?
Yeah, thanks, Timothy. I know I made that a multifaceted question. I'll try to pair it. I'll try to pare it down. So we talked some about this idea of being brothers in arms, and unification, the military being a unifying space. Do you see any burgeoning opportunities in relation to today's societal issues where really the military could be a driving force in creating unity amongst folks?
I think that some of the conversations that you brought up around, for instance, the Tuskegee Airmen, I think maybe there is an opportunity for people to learn history through the vehicle of the military. I think sometimes when people see things like this in the news, even if it can be frustrating to hear the way it's being addressed today, this notion of it being I don't know, something that shouldn't be taught. I think it's extremely topical, and I'm not sure if it quite answers your question, but I think it does at least generate conversation around it. And I hope that at least if somebody doesn't know who the Tuskegee Airmen are, maybe a few people learned about their story this last week or two.
I think one of the pieces of this that's difficult is that the military is this foreign and separate entity to a lot of Americans that only becomes top of mind when something bad has happened. And the reason I'm saying that, I remember when I deployed for the first time. A friend of mine, she's a teacher. When I told her I was deploying, she was shocked. She was shocked because according to her, like she had thought that the war had ended in Afghanistan and that we were done with it. And that moment always stuck out to me because after 9/11, I think one of the greatest failures was when President Bush told the American people to go back and shop instead of telling the American people what they were going to have to sacrifice. And from my vantage point, I'm not entirely optimistic on what the military can do as an entity in and of itself outside of some of these conversations to build about that unity. I have like other ideas. I would love to see some of our big forts in more metropolitan city. Like I would love to see Fort Drum, New York, in New York City. And I would love to see just the American people in particular just forced with the reality of like who's going out to fight these wars. Um, and I think until that happens, I'm not entirely optimistic, but we'll keep trying, of course. But until there's, in my opinion, some sacrifice being at, or you're forced to face the faces of people that are going to enact violence on your behalf, I find it kind of difficult.
So, thank you, Timothy. So, I think from my point of view, there's two sides to this. I know we tend to look at everything through the lens as an American, but when you're overseas and you're in a joint command, you're with all branches, and you're also with um, the country that you're in, and so you get to see what we look like through the lens of someone else's face, people that you're going to fight alongside of, and what they feel we represent and they represent. And I think as the military in and of itself, um, here in America, I think we have one view, but I think there is it's bigger than this one view. My brother fought in Afghanistan too, 4 times, so I've and stationed in South Korea for a long time, and so we've had a chance to hop back and forth to see him and see things from a different point of view. So I'm an optimistic, internal optimist. So I will say that I think. Thank you, Timothy. I know you're laughing, but it's true. I think these lessons that we're learning right now, we have to have a broader lens, because if we're only looking at them from the lens of an American, then you've got a really narrow point of view, and it's much bigger than that. And so I'm optimistic that my fellow soldiers in other branches in other countries um, um, will help with our identity crisis. Sometimes it seems like we're having here.
Yeah, thank you all. And I think just talking through that question, it reminded me of some of Leah's slides at the beginning about this double V, campaign, right? It's not just necessarily what's going on in the broader world, but also what's going on at home, and thinking about the victory around social identity and having an inclusive community. And I guess this is a related question. I know that there was a lot of talk about economic mobility, or rationales for joining the military. Do you believe the military is still regarded as an outlet for positive social change, even within light of some of the changes that have recently been occurring within the Department of Defense, Department of Justice, et cetera?
I absolutely think it, and I think the response, to be honest, of what the current president decided to remove these clubs and this attack on the DEI stuff is actually evidence of that because they were very quite effective. I know for like myself, when I was at West Point, these clubs were not they weren't excluding anybody. They're actually very inclusive. And a lot of times they were the place where I could actually breathe a little bit and be held accountable for actions that I was and the way I was behaving on campus, because there was also like a culture shift that I had to undergo where, I didn't grow up in this like structure, like military environment. So like a lot of these organizations that President Trump decided to just disband and get were powerful retention tools, and keeping me there and just keeping like some other classmates there. And then those relationships are ongoing. Like I work at Google now, and a lot of the folks who I interacted with in these clubs are the same people that I work with now at Google. And I'm like 10 plus years outside of like a uniform at this point. Um, so absolutely, I think that the military has definitely has an opportunity. And I think that the military is better at it than I've seen the private sector. They just take it more seriously, because at the end of the day, they're about like, how do we create the most powerful like fighting force in the world? And that means like they don't have time to worry about these like superficial or characteristics of people. It's like, can you shoot? Can you run? And can you talk on this radio? It's how I would love for like that skill identification to be placed in the private sector, where it's like that cut and dry. That's like sometimes the only thing I miss. But I was to say, yeah, I think there's definitely like an opportunity for the military, but it starts with the political leadership and the American people who put these people there in the first place. The military it can only do so much. So it takes the communities to elect a certain people, to make sure that they're electing the right people who are going to be leading the armed forces.
So I also think too, sorry, I was piggybacking on Timothy, but I agree. But I'm also saying there's a lot of things, there's a lot of reasons people join the military. And as an economic force, especially in the African American community, it's one way for you to join an organization, get skilled training, have a career, and all these benefits that the military offers. It can literally change your station in life, which it did for my family. So I'm saying to anyone, yes, we have a role to play, but it plays again a bigger role, because it's one space where you can come in as a high school graduate, get a college and a master's degree at no cost to you, have 3 squares a day, a place to live, community built, a skill training that you can translate into civilian training. So from that point of view, it's a powerful mechanism to change the game, if you will, for our community and our culture. If we can get past or get around or understand or embrace what its ultimate goal is. It is a fighting machine. At the end of the day, that's what we're trained to do and how to think. And we just don't have a lot of time to think about your feelings and, are you going to save me? I need to know, if you're going to shoot that gun, if someone's shooting at me, are you going to help me? Are you the person in the trenches with me? Are we ride and die? Are we coming at this thing all together? And there's not a lot of time in the military for whether or not I hurt your feelings.
I had mentioned that one of the more popular pursuits on Grenier Air Force Base was boxing. And part of the reason for that was because of Joe Louis, also known as the Brown Bomber, who his career, I think, is a good example of the ways that the military can elicit social change, because he was one of the most well-known figures in sports history at the time, also served his country. And it was through his platform and his messaging that I think he did call attention to a lot of civil rights causes. So I think he is an example of how the military can be a vehicle for change.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. Yeah, and I think I'm reminded of some things that I researched in the university archives as well around military and veteran services. I know, Andrea, we were talking about UNH being a huge mainstay. I mean, being in a small state like New Hampshire with really few opportunities or options for higher education, I think the university has benefited a lot from folks. And just thinking about boxing, even I believe there was a somewhat of a controversy, but a victory within the university boxing community with a with a person who identified as Black back in the 1930s. I'll have to find some more information, but I do recall reading about that. So love to see those histories sometimes overlapping. And speaking of the university, I want to ensure that I have enough time here for folks to be able to have Q&A. So I would love to call upon one of my colleagues from UNH, Michelle Holt-Shannon, who is going to be helping us out with the Q&A. So Michelle, please.
Thanks, Sharon, and thanks everybody. It was great hearing your stories. I'll share these group agreements, and we definitely want to get your questions in the chat. You can also raise your hand and we'll make our way to you, and you can come off camera and ask your question live as well. So please be thinking about how you want to ask your question. Please be respectful and use respectful language. The microphone is when we're in person, so we're on a snow day. But yeah, definitely speak up because it's helpful for all of us to be able to hear. Listen generously to learn. Please don't interrupt. We want everyone to be able to share airtime, and so be crisp with your questions so we can get back to our panelists and hear as much from them as we can. Be mindful that good intentions can still have a harmful impact, so pay attention to your questions. And we would love for folks to just be able to, share an incomplete thought and be able to, take the stories and the learning, but allowing folks to share their own stories. So ask permission if you want to share someone else's story if they share today. So those are our group agreements. And I see one hand. I saw your question in the chat too, Kathy. Do you want to ask it live?
It's the
Kathy
same.
Wolf.
I was going to ask the same question, which was
Okay.
To what extent do you think the military leaders today, not counting the Secretary of Defense, would resist unconstitutional orders even if they came from the president? What kind of leadership exists under the Secretary of Defense that might be willing to resist?
Andrea or Timothy want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, Andrew, I'll defer to you first.
So the leadership that's in the military from memory and from following it and still having friends and family in there in the service, we're called with an honor and a dignity and a respect to the Constitution and to protect this country. And we've never been faced with someone who would ask us to do something that was purely immoral and ethical. I will tell you something, though. We have military justice. So I do believe there is a guardrail still that exists, which is we are still held accountable for the actions that we take and the things that we do. And the leadership, when you get to be a 1 and a 2 and a 3-star general, you have gone through the fire, you have been tested, you have been you're combat ready. So all these things matter. So I'm trying to give you some hope in that it's not the wild, wild west. It's still a military organization. And there are rules, regulations, governances that we follow as ethical practices for being and using a commander-in-chief that we're hoping will tell us the truth and will tell us what we need to do. So I think there may be some back and forth, but I don't believe in my heart of hearts that a true 4-3-2-4-star general is going to do something that's truly unethical and against the American population. I just don't believe it.
The only thing I was going to add is the military, in terms of the officers, there's a very clear set of professional guidelines and expectations. So as Andrea mentions, the U.S. military is unique in the sense that you swear an oath to the Constitution and not a person. And that point of differentiation provides almost like a check in the case of a political leader who is less than virtuous, using the military for nefarious reasons or wherever they may be. So like in terms of like professional services, like that is something that is when I was at West Point, it was something that was emphasized quite in a persistent manner. Every military leader, as they move up in the chain of command, there's a additional training and education that's pushed down on what the contours of the constitutions are, what are lawful and unlawful orders. So there's a significant amount of rigor that's like placed on just the professionalization of the U.S. military. It's not foolproof in terms of dealing with the times we are dealing with are quite, I'll say, yeah, unique and challenging. So I think we'll definitely see. But what I will say is that military leaders are very well aware of where their allegiances lie. And I think the hopeful piece of it is that they are part of a broader set of community in and out of uniform that still expect those guidelines and the professional standards to be abided by. So I think that's the one silver lining, and the wisdom of our founding was the professionalization of military service and the oath and allegiance being sworn to the Constitution.
There's a couple of, thank you both. There's a couple of more that are very connected to what you just answered, both of you. Is the larger military today positioned to be able to stop an authoritarian overthrow of the Constitution? Is there today some sort of authoritarian influence that would prevent the assistance of the military? And then kind of a corollary is, can the generals be fired by the president? Maybe you can take that one, Timothy.
No, I would say there is a chain of command. So yeah, the generals can definitely be relieved if the commander in chief decides. But like Lee, you're the historian, so defer.
Well, I mean, historically, I can't think of a relevant recent like 20th century example off the top of my head. To me, coming from my lens, at least from what I've studied, this is kind of entering new territory.
Yeah, the only other example of a general being fired for undermining the president that I can remember is like if you go back to when President Obama relieved General Stanley McChrystal in Afghanistan after there was a Rolling Stone story that was published. So if you want to see an example, that's like one. Even when President Trump was president the first time, I don't remember him relieving any generals.
Yeah, and I guess I'll jump in here and just say I don't know anything specifically around military expectations, but I know the Article 2 powers of the presidency have often been called into question. Within our history, one of the main examples I think about in relation to race specifically is when President Abraham Lincoln was workshopping the Emancipation Proclamation and things like that. And so a lot of it comes back to what authority the Constitution provides the executive branch. And I think there's a lot of nuance there. I think there are going to be a lot of questions of first impression for the courts. And I think some of that is going to come down to it's going to come down to judicial interpretation. And I don't know, maybe Timothy or Andrea too, you know more about like the DOJ and like kind of how things work in different things. But I know the military has a lot of its own different like tribunals and its own different adjudicatory bodies. So I think it's a very complex question.
Yeah, the military has its own uniform code of military justice, its own processes, and I will say there's a bias towards command authority, because command authority is something that's seen as absolutely necessary in times of conflict, where you have one commander that's giving orders, but all soldiers are legally allowed to not obey unlawful orders. So.
Thank you, Timothy. That's correct.
So we're sticking with the theme here. Lois has added a question about how police forces across the country are dealing with the presence of members who lean or are white nationalists, and that can have a negative impact on law enforcement. Does the oath to the Constitution taken by military offer enough protection from belief systems contrary to the oath?
In the oath, there's a line that says all enemies, foreign and domestic. So that domestic piece is if there is a deemed to be some type of like a threat internally, then the military does. There is a authority that's provided to protect those. Now, in terms of belief systems, that's a little bit outside of my pay grade in terms of like
Yeah.
expertise. But what I can tell you when I was in Afghanistan, like that was, yeah, we did have a couple of soldiers that were Nazi affiliated, and the corrective mechanism that was provided was the commander who I worked for served those soldiers with a certain levels like adjudication and punishment because hate is I can't remember the exact regulation, but it's not allowed. So it's there is like a legal authority that can be pushed down if soldiers are found to be associated with domestic terrorists.
Thank you. Andrea?
What I found too was my service time was you can believe what you want to believe, but when you come like any organization, right? Believe what you want to believe, but when you're with the greater body, right, there is a code of ethics that we follow, and we all believe the same thing, right? At that point, and that is we serve the Constitution of the United States. We've got orders that we've got to take. So the belief system is not something that's checked. I mean, I can believe what I want to believe. Timothy can believe what he wants to believe, but when we are in that uniform, we believe the same thing.
Thank you. Other folks with questions? How do you envision the change in the military with the removal of DEI?
I'll let you take that one, Timothy.
I don't think, to be honest, I don't think DEI has gone anywhere. Because I think a lot of times, like at least when I'm not going to try to be put myself in President Trump's head because it seems to be chaotic. Like I think a lot of there's this perception that DEI just means black, when in actuality it's sex, it's socioeconomic, and it's also regional. So when I mean by, I'll give you a quick example. So at West Point, one of the requirements for any applicant to receive an appointment is that they have to be nominated by their congressperson or a senator. That is a form of DEI because it is seen as a national security imperative that we don't have a concentration of the service members all coming from the South. So that means every senator, congressperson, and throughout the United States is essentially required to send somebody from their area to the United States Military Academy, Naval Academy, et cetera, and go through that process. That's a form of DEI. So when you think about hiring, even when veterans like decide to get out, that's a form of DEI. So I think what's going to happen more so is the language will likely change. Maybe some like the guidelines will change, but it's here because also like DEI is America. There's a lot of regional diversity. There's a lot of racial diversity. People come from like all different types of religions. So like to remove DEI is basically to remove America, in my opinion. So it doesn't. I think it would just be evolved along the way, and we'll see like what comes of it like, a little bit later. But I don't see it going anywhere. And I think the administration is starting to see that. It's like it's a very broad term, but in their mind they just thought it was black folks. So
It's always been my experience in the military has been very diverse from my experience. Different backgrounds, cultures, people from everywhere are in the military. So the term DEI, I guess, maybe we were ahead of its time. I don't know. I don't know. So I'm not, I'm not going to say every space in the military is inclusive, but I'm going to tell you that in the ranks, the rank and file, it's very diverse. Your roommate or your bunkmate or whatever could be from anywhere. And again, it's not just about African American people. So you've got diversity of thought all over the military. You've got different backgrounds, different religions. I mean, it truly is a melting pot. So I'm not sure DEI in the service is anything's going to change. I think it's going to look the same.
Thank you. Jerry Ann.
This is a history question for Lay that I've always wondered about. How did New Hampshire become such a end up with so many bases? And why New Hampshire?
Well, it's actually kind of a geographical answer. It's because of where we're positioned. So Grenier itself was selected for a couple different reasons. I've had it hinted to me that a few of it were just political connections. There were some people serving in the local government who were connected down in DC who wanted the Air Force to come up, or at that time, the Army Air Force, to come to the area. But there's also a benefit to the fact that it's close enough to the coast to be able to defend the coast in the event of an attack. However, it's far enough away that it itself wouldn't be directly attacked. So there would be time to scramble. So that was one of the reasons why that particular area was selected. But there was also a route that specifically, because at that time, aircraft you couldn't just hop in a plane and go around the world, obviously. So you had to be making frequent stops. So the idea was that they would go up through Canada, Newfoundland, Greenland. There were a couple slight variations on the routes they could take, but they had to be able to stop along the way, going over to Europe. And that's why New Hampshire was kind of a prime point, because we're one of the most northeast locations you can be in the country. So that's why we were a popular location for bases.
And my follow-up question to that would be, what were our communities ready for the influx of these diverse populations?
I would say yes and no. No, because it was just, you saw the photos. It was such a dramatic shift in what the community looked like, literally almost overnight. That was a huge buildup of infrastructure and people. And, it was a massive change for the residents. I've spoken to people whose farmlands were taken by eminent domain for the building of that base, who are still angry about it. And there were certainly conflicts within Manchester, talking a little bit about, disciplinary action against people who might not have very inclusive ideologies. They did have ways of dealing with that even back in World War II. There were a couple of incidents that I tried to investigate, but the process around which people were penalized was really not very transparent. But on the flip side of that, I will say that there were other individuals. I found a bunch of USO recordings. They're at the Manchester Historic Association. And some of those workers, they would really go out of their way. If they saw somebody being treated in a way that was less than equitable, quite a few of them remembered it their entire lives and appreciated the influx of new ideologies, new people, from around the country, not to mention the fact that a lot of marriages began at Grenier. So I think you also see a lot of families who came to the area and stayed.
Thanks, Leah. I don't know if anyone has an update on the head of the Coast Guard who was fired, a woman that was mentioned in the chat as well. So one of the other questions was just how have your intersecting identities impacted you while in the military?
I think for me, uh, you know, I came from a really like, abusive and chaotic childhood, and uh, interestingly, like when I got to West Point, while it was very disciplined and very foreign place, it was also stable. I kind of knew what to expect day to day. And because it was stable, I actually had time to think about and explore other parts of my identity. So like I'm also like a queer person. Um, like also like I have more of a, I'm a creative. So like, I actually had time to just like think about those things like a little
Mm,
bit more. And when I got to West Point, like in particular, I remember like Don't Ask, Don't Tell was being repealed, which was basically like the
mm,
policy that said that if you were gay, lesbian, bisexual, the transgender folks were um, dealt with later, I guess. Uh, that you couldn't tell anybody that you were what your sexual orientation was, but nobody could ask you. So it was just like this weird halfway policy that Bill Clinton decided to push through basically as a giveaway to the Republicans. And so like as that policy was being repealed, I think the thing that I remember like most was it was a part of my like identity that I hadn't fully like dealt with, but the institution was in this weird way forcing me to deal with it.
mm,
Because it's part of like the implementation, like once President Obama decided to remove it and got approved through Congress, is that the U.S. Army had about a year to figure out how to make sure that the Army itself was ready for this change in policy. So like that identity identity in terms of myself was ongoing, and the same time as the institution was thinking about things. And it just yeah, obviously like was like deeply personal, but I'm like thankful for that experience because it forced me to just like engage with a different part of like myself, and by extension a different part of my about a different community that I was also part of, but wasn't fully
mhm,
ready to attach myself to at the time. And I think the benefit of it after when I graduated and became an officer and was like leading soldiers, it made me much more empathetic.
mm,
I wouldn't say I was like the best shot or like the best person, at land navigation, wherever the case may be. But I was a very good and empathetic like leader. It's like I just knew and I just read my soldiers better than some of my other colleagues who were, just like, no fault of their own. They were just straight white dudes. Um, so like they hadn't been forced to just deal with like some of the excavation that happens when you're in a place that not just in your own life, but also in an institution that at the time didn't know what to do with you. So I don't
mhm.
know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, that's great. Anyone else want to comment? Andrea, I didn't know if you wanted to say
Well,
anything.
it, thank you, Timothy. Appreciate your story. The
Mhm,
I guess the intersection for me was I realized early on that um, kind of cliche a little, but it's true that my father, knowing where he grew up and what he was able to accomplish, and then our family joining, so we were a true military family. We had a lot of discipline in our home um, because that was what you do when you're a military family. I didn't realize all the impact that it had on me until I became an adult, and understanding that I was around people that told me I could do anything I wanted to do if I wanted to do it, however I wanted to do it, when I wanted to do it. Nobody was standing in my way but me. Um, so in our household, that became what we saw. I also had a chance to see my father change career fields a couple of times, so that showed me what that was about. The leadership training that I got from the military, bar none, best on the planet. To be able to lead troops overseas and in the Pentagon was huge for me. So I have nothing but strong feelings about the service. My father was one who said everybody should serve at least two, so you understand what freedom really means. And so, from where I sit and with my kids, my daughters, my hope is that they understand it is the best group out there. The U.S. military is strong. The people that are in it are committed, and it has done nothing for our family but lift us up. And I have to say, when you add that plus New Hampshire, and I nothing but kudos for New Hampshire. It's my background. It's what I'm representing. So it made me a better person. I'll put it that way. Stronger person.
Great, thank you. There's a question about spiritual growth, and Timothy, you talked about that time, space to reflect, and the question is sort of about the impact of serving in the military on either your spiritual life or growth, even reflecting on your own mortality, which has got to be a part of that experience. So, any thoughts to share there?
I think, the thing that comes to mind for me, honestly, and when I think about spirit, I think much about connection with others. And Andrew has like touched on this a little bit. It's like you just really don't have time when you're like on a damn mountain or in dusty Afghanistan to be too focused on difference. Um, so what happens is that you end up having conversations with people in a very like real and visceral way on like the things that just like hurting them, like this deeply like spiritually like hurting them. Insecurities they had with their families. Like when I deployed, I had maybe like two or three of my friends who had their firstborn children, born while they're overseas. You know what I mean? You think about like what that like to be not to be there during like that time. Um, that is like something that I always kind of like admired about them, but also just like had a lot of empathy for, and then not being able to just be there for like those moments. And I think for me, with the other part of it too, at least in terms of like my spirituality, is like, being like in service. Like there were like moments where I definitely felt lonely. So I kind of, I don't know if it was like the ancestors or what have you, but when like those moments, there was just always either somebody I could talk to, but also, when you are, in these mountains and trying to take these tests and balancing 22 credit hours, taking survival swimming, getting punched in the face, punching people in the face for boxing, is that there is like this like internal confidence that you start to build as you slowly but surely and incrementally just start to like knock down these tasks and getting thrown all these things that this institution is being asked of you. And like the President Obama story, I think the thing that I remember like the most was after that happened, one of the generals had to talk to the entire Corps of Cadets and get them together and say like, hey, this black man is your new commander in chief, and you will respect him. And the black cadets, we all like got together. There was a black faculty there, and we had a family talk and said, just remember that like who you are, what you stand for, and you have every right to be here. And whatever they're dealing with, their desire to hate more instead of loving themselves more, that's their business. You came here for a reason. Get your degree, get your commission, and go make something of yourself. Because there's like we got too many other problems to be worrying about, whatever they're dealing with. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
It's an interesting question, spirituality in the military. I'm going to tell you that was an interesting question, but it does put you in an environment to think about longevity of life and what freedom truly means, and why someone would agree to risk their life for people they don't know, and how you can find the good in everybody from all over, people from anywhere. There's good in there. You take a minute or two. So from that point of view, it does make you a broader thinker as far as differences in people. You'll find similarities. And it brings you closer together. I will tell you that. When you're put in a situation, you have a lot of time to think about, do I like you? I don't like you. Who cares? We've got to do this and we got to get it done. So you grow up. You literally grow up. And some of these things just don't matter. It just doesn't matter. I'll tell you one little funny story. As a fashionista, someone who likes clothing, and likes to look nice, you join the military, you get one uniform. It looks the same every single day. And so everybody's wearing the same uniform. So who cares? It's like it's one less thing that makes us different. And if we could just run everything like that, where it's just one less thing that makes us different. We all have on those low heels, Jerry Ann, and we all have on these outfits. That's one of the things. We're all carrying the same weapon. We're all having the same lived experience, getting dropped off in the middle of nowhere, trying to figure out how to get out, right? So I say spiritually, it makes you mature and look at everybody as a valued human. Life is short.
Thank you, Sharon.
Yeah, Michelle, thank you. I know we're getting close to wrapping up this time, and I guess I just wanted to harken back to the previous question too about intersectionality during people's time in the military. And I would also kind of flip the script on that question and say sometimes the military can lead to deeper understanding of intersectionality or even creating it. So like for my story, you know, my parents, they met because my dad was in the military. He was stationed in Virginia, and that's where my mom's from. And so just thinking about some of the intersectional identities that I have are related to the opportunities that the military afforded. So, and I think, you know, some of what Timothy was like talking about too, just like having that time and space to like explore yourself as a person. And I just think that there's going back to the idea when I asked the question of, you know, do we think that the military is still, you know, this space for societal advancement and everything like that? I heard a resounding yes from both Andrea and Timothy, right? And so I just think that being able to frame that kind of in that context of leaning into the greater representation, you know, the greater inclusion and diversity that military specifically brought to New Hampshire. So, and thank you all for being here. I thank again all of our panelists. I want to take a moment to pass things over to Jerry Ann because I believe we are getting ready to wrap up.
Well, I will just add my my notes of thanks to all you panelists. This was a very eye-opening and very personal panel. I really appreciate the personal stories and the bit of history that Leah brought to our panel today. Got to come and see your museum to learn more about the military here in New Hampshire. There's so much we don't know, and so getting that little peek inside this your own times, Timothy, Andrea, and Sharon in the military was helpful. What I did, like what Sharon said, it was a place for upward mobility for people of color and brought them into a whole new world of being, traveling, a skill set. And I think as one of the tools for us for upward mobility, it worked. And I know also that, you know, we have our differences as individuals in these places, in these predominantly white spaces. So as a country, we would expect to see some of those issues there as well. But I totally enjoyed and am very appreciative of the different view that you brought. One of our person online summed it up really well. I think it was Rebecca Cursor. She said, "Thank you for sharing this very personal story. It gives us pause to think about these words with what is happening today. I think it is important to keep this in mind as we figure out how to respond in the environment that we are today." So I think she really, put a exclamation on how we can look and see the world that we're in today. And if we look at it with different lens, like Andrea said, open up our eyes differently, we have a different view of the world. So I thank you all for joining us. And next week will be our closing Black History Month Tea Talk entitled Eyes on the Prize, Protest Movement and the Road Ahead. So we're looking at new movements and still carrying this theme of the art of war. And that should be another engaging conversation. I thank you and thank our donors and our supporters, the New Hampshire Humanities, and look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you all so much.